talk about the last method of slider fishing, and that would be method number one, the friction-free slider, or FFS. FFS. So after we've dropped our ball down to that 8, 10, or wherever you're going to drop it, we're going to pull that rod out of the rod holder. Up here, we're going to take the slider, which again is going to be a 7 to 9 foot piece of fluorocarbon, preferably 20 pound, with a ball bearing number 2 snap swivel on one end, same on the other end with a spoon. We're going to go ahead and snap on that ball bearing swivel on the one end, toss that slider in the water, make sure it hits the water and it is working properly, and then we are going to loosen the drag up on our rigger, and then we are going to send that downrigger down all the way, in this case, to 60 footer. And that slider, which again you added up here and started the descent all the way down, is going to stay, with the help of friction, right in that 50 foot, which is again 8 to 10 feet or so, where you dropped it in up here. Some of you might say, no way, there's no way that that slider maintained that distance while that downrigger ball descended all the way down to its set position at 60 feet. But I'm going to argue against your thought of it not staying there and tell you it will stay approximately close to that 10-foot difference of the main ball versus having it up here in La La Land, which you might think. You might say, how do I know that that's true? How do I know that this slider didn't end up in the belly somewhere much higher than 8 to 10 feet above the bottom? Real simple is, many times when you pull your downer up, maybe just to check for weeds, check for debris, you don't even trip your rod, you just hit the up switch, you reel it up as it comes up. What you're going to see is that slider is going to stay almost in the same exact position as you started up here when you dropped it. Again, in that 8 to 10 foot in this instance. Second reason is, when we get fish that bite that slider, knowing that the bottom bait's only 10 feet difference and then maybe 10 feet back off this ball, when that rod gets bit, we trip it or the fish trips it, but typically when they hit the slider, I have to trip the rod. It's just, the tip is just gonna jingle up here. Jingle, jingle. You gotta grab the rod, pop it, crank down to get this slider to end up back here. A lot of times, I'm not reeling in 40 or 35 feet plus this distance to catch up to that slider. I'm gonna pull that rod, trip it, crank just a handful of times, which is gonna be equivalent to that 8 to 10 feet, plus the distance here to connect this slider with this swivel. That's another reason we know they're not, ending up in La La Land where we don't know where they're at. So, and there's a couple more reasons why we know they're not, moving around more than where we set those. So that's why we call it a friction-free slider, because the boat's traveling this way, so the water's actually going this way. Believe it or not, that snap or snap swivel is going to be held relatively taut in position on your monofilament line just by the boat going this way and the current, not the current, but the water pressure going this way to keep that slider about 8 to 10 feet above that bottom bait or wherever you decide to put it. Now, there will be times where you go ahead and drop that bottom bait down to 10 feet or so. You toss that slider in, then you go ahead and send that rigger ball down. And you're gonna notice that this slider that you added is not, going down very quickly. It almost looks like it's hung here, it's suspended while the main line drops. That does happen once in a while due to water current or direction of troll. You will find that will hang up there once in a while, but that's probably 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 instances where that'll occur, and it's due to current or other reasons. When that happens, you can do two things. One is you could just continue to let that ball down to where you're going to drop it, and then let that slider work its way all the way down, probably to the belly of the line. So you're still fishing with a slider at that point. It's not a semi-fixed or a friction slider, as we call it here. It's going to be out here in the middle. So you can leave that as is and it'll eventually work its way down to that point. Or B, what we do often is I'm gonna, what I call overdrive this down. I'm gonna go ahead and drop this down to maybe 70 feet, okay? When you do that, you allow that slider that is kind of floating up here in suspension, it'll eventually kick in and go down. What I found that if you overdrive it in those instances, down to 70 or 72 feet, you hit the button on the rigger, stop it for maybe 10 seconds, and then you're gonna bring that back up to your target depth. In this case, it's 60 feet. That slider will eventually settle in close to where you want it to be, in that 10 foot above the bottom bait or thereabouts. So that's how we get those to eventually get down, by overdriving the rigger, settling it in, waiting, and then bringing it back up. When this slider gets bit, okay, 9 times out of 10, you're gonna have to trip that rod, okay, and reel your butt off really fast to allow this slider to connect all the way with the snap swivel in the front of the spoon. And at that point, you'll have good tension on that rod, but you're still gonna have to reel. However, the distance of reeling is minimized because you're again about 10 foot above the bottom bait, plus this distance, versus a slider that might be midpoint up here in the belly of the line. So what you've done is you've not only identified that that fish bit close to the bottom bait, so it tells you that it was a 50-foot bite, so it gives you some intel. Secondly, the amount of reeling and lost fish is diminished because this slider, which is technically a free slider, is only this far away from the bottom bait and the connection where it eventually ends up on the head of the spoon up against the snap swivel. So just like the fourth method we started with in this series, you're going to have a number 2 Dreamweaver or equivalent ball bearing snap swivel, about 7 to 9 feet of 20-pound fluorocarbon leader material, number 2 snap swivel, and your spoon. Same basic setup. Okay, we're going to replay this one more time to make sure you get it. We're going to drop our downrigger down about 8 to 10 feet, with the main line attached, okay, down here. Then we're going to take the rod out of the rod holder, affix that slider, toss it in the water, make sure the spoon is not fouled up, and then we're going to descent that rigger down to target depth of 60 feet, which will put the bottom ball here and bait and that friction-free slider about 10 foot above it. Simple as that.